I had the phone in my hand. His name was on the screen. I put it down and told myself tomorrow. I was hoping he would call. I didn't want to impose.
I was going to call him that Thursday evening. I had the phone in my hand. His number was already on the screen. I had been staring at it for almost 20 minutes, rehearsing what I would say, how I would start, whether I would open with an apology or just say his name and let the silence do the rest. I put the phone down. I told myself I would call tomorrow, that tomorrow would be easier, that I had already waited 4 years, so one more night wouldn't change anything. I was wrong. One night changed everything. My name is Marcus. I am 38 years old, and the heaviest thing I carry is not grief. It is not anger. It is not even regret, though regret is part of it. The heaviest thing I carry is a phone call I never made to a man who died waiting to hear from me. My father's name was David. He was 65 years old when he died. Quiet, hardworking, stubborn in the way that men of his generation were stubborn, not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of pride so deeply rooted that he probably couldn't have named it himself if you asked him. He grew up with nothing. Raised by a single mother in a neighborhood where the fastest way out was either education or trouble, and David chose education, not because anyone encouraged him, but because he was afraid of what the alternative looked like. He worked his way through school, got a job at a manufacturing plant when he was 19, and stayed at that same plant for 31 years. 31 years of early mornings and late nights and calloused hands and a lunchbox he carried so consistently that the handle eventually wore through on one side. He was not a man who talked about feelings. He was not a man who knew how to sit beside you and ask what was wrong. He showed love the only way he knew how, by working. By making sure there was food on the table and shoes on our feet and a roof that didn't leak. By paying every bill on time, even when I know now, looking back, that there were months when doing so must have cost him things I never saw or understood as a child. What he could not do was be present. I remember my school play when I was 9 years old. I had one line. One single line, and I had practiced it in front of the bathroom mirror every day for 2 weeks until I could say it without my voice shaking. My mother was in the 3rd row. I found her face the moment I walked onto that stage, and I held onto it like a lifeline. My father's seat beside her was empty. He had been called in for an overtime shift. He told me afterward quietly, while I still had stage makeup on my face, that he was sorry, that he had tried to get someone to cover for him. That he would make it up to me. He never did. Not because he didn't want to, I understand that now, but because something else always came first. Another shift, another bill, another obligation that felt to him like love but felt to me at 9 years old like absence. That was the first time I remember deciding, quietly, somewhere deep inside myself, that I would not need him, that needing him only led to empty chairs. By the time I was a teenager, the distance between us had become something we both maintained without discussing. He worked. I studied. We ate at the same table most evenings and spoke about practical things, school, the weather, whether the car needed to be serviced. We never fought. We never shouted. We never said the things that needed to be said. Silence, I have learned, is not the absence of a problem. Silence is just a problem that has learned to be patient. I left for university at 18 and came back less and less each year. Not dramatically, not with slammed doors or final words, just gradually less. A phone call replaced by a text. A visit replaced by an excuse. 4 days at Christmas becoming 3, then 2, then 1 awkward afternoon that we both seemed relieved to see end. My sister, Diane, stayed closer to home. She would call me sometimes, gently, in the way that people who love both sides of a conflict learn to speak carefully. Dad asked about you, she would say. Call him, I would say. I didn't. What changed was not dramatic. There was no single moment, no thunderbolt, no event that cracked me open and forced me to see things differently. It was slower than that. It was quieter. I was 35 when I started going to therapy. Not because of my father specifically, because of a relationship that had ended badly and left me sitting in my apartment one Sunday afternoon unable to explain, even to myself, why I kept pushing people away before they could leave me first. My therapist, a calm woman named Dr. Osei, had a way of asking questions that didn't feel like questions. They felt like doors she was holding open, waiting to see if I would walk through them myself. One afternoon she asked me when I first learned that love and disappointment came together. I didn't answer for a long time, then I said, my father's seat was empty at my school play. She didn't say anything. She just nodded slowly, the way people nod when they recognize something true. We spent the next 2 years walking through doors I had kept shut for decades. Not just about my father, about the version of myself that had learned, at 9 years old, to need nothing from anyone, because needing things led to empty chairs. I began to understand, slowly and painfully, and with a great deal of resistance, that my father had not been absent because he didn't love me. He had been absent because he had never been taught how to be present, because his own father had not been there. Because the only language of love he had ever learned was provision, working, providing, protecting, and he had spoken that language as fluently as he could for 31 years without ever knowing that I needed a different dialect entirely, understanding that did not erase the pain. But it changed its shape. It moved it from something that felt like rejection to something that felt like grief. And grief, Dr. Osai told me once, is just love with nowhere to go. By the time I was 37, I had made a decision. I was going to call my father, not to relitigate the past, not to list every empty chair and missed moment and unanswered need, just to tell him that I understood now as much as I could understand, that I had spent a long time being angry at a man who had simply loved me in the only way he knew how, and that I forgave him for it. I didn't rush. I thought about what I would say for months. I wrote drafts, actual written drafts, in a notebook I kept on my bedside table, because I knew that if I tried to say it off the top of my head I would either say too much or lose my nerve entirely and say nothing. By October I felt ready. I had the words. I knew how I wanted to start. I knew what I wanted him to know before the call ended. On the Thursday evening of the 3rd week of October, I picked up my phone, opened my contacts, and found his name, David, just his name. No title, no label. Just David, the way I had saved it when I was 18 and still believed that using his first name instead of Dad was a form of independence rather than what it actually was, a small, silent way of keeping him at a distance, even in my own phone. I stared at his name for almost 20 minutes. Then I put the phone down and told myself I would call tomorrow. That night, David sat alone in the house I hadn't visited in 4 years. I don't know what he did that evening, whether he watched television or read or simply sat quietly the way he often did in the evenings, comfortable in silences that had always made me restless. I don't know if he thought about me. I don't know if he had any sense, the way people sometimes claim to have, that something was ending. What I know is that sometime in the night, quietly, without drama, without warning, his heart simply stopped, by the time my sister called me the next morning. My father had already been gone for 6 hours, and the words I had spent a year preparing had nowhere left to go. My sister's voice on the phone that morning was the quietest I had ever heard it. Diane is not a quiet person. She laughs loudly and talks with her hands, even on phone calls you cannot see, and when she is upset, she says exactly what she means without softening it first. But that Friday morning her voice was so small and so careful that I knew before she finished her first sentence. "Marcus," she said, "it's Dad." 2 words, that was all she needed. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time after she told me, not crying, not moving, just sitting with the phone still pressed to my ear long after she had finished speaking, as though staying on the line could somehow keep the information from becoming fully real. The morning light was coming through my curtains in long pale strips across the floor. I remember watching the dust move in those strips of light and thinking, absurdly, that the world looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. That nothing outside my window had shifted or paused or marked the moment in any visible way. My father was gone, and the world had simply continued. I drove to my sister's house that same morning. She lived 40 minutes from me, close enough that I had visited her regularly over the years, close enough that I had no real excuse for how infrequently I had made the additional 30-minute drive to my father's house on the other side of the city. I had simply not made it, not found the time, not felt ready. Diane opened the door before I even knocked. She looked like she had been awake all night, which she had. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she was still wearing the clothes she had put on the day before, a grey sweatshirt and dark leggings, and she pulled me into a hug at the door that lasted longer than any hug we had exchanged in years. We sat in her kitchen, she made tea neither of us drank, and she told me what had happened. He had been found by his neighbor, Mr. Ibarra, a retired schoolteacher who lived next door and had formed the quiet habit of checking on my father every morning since my mother had passed 3 years earlier. Mr. Ibarra had noticed that my father's kitchen light which came on every morning at 6, was still off at 8. He had knocked. He had waited. Then he had called Diane. My father had died in his bedroom, in his bed. Peacefully, the paramedics believed, in his sleep. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand beside him, folded neatly on top of a book he had apparently been reading the night before. A glass of water, half finished. His work boots, which he still kept polished out of a habit that had outlasted his working years, standing side by side near the door. Everything orderly, everything in its place. Even at the end, my father had been a man who left things neat. "He talked about you," Diane said after a long silence. I looked up at her. "Often," she said, "more than you probably know." I didn't answer. I didn't know what to do with that information. It sat in my chest like something too large to swallow. "He used to ask me if you were okay," she continued. He never asked it in a dramatic way. You know how he was. He would just say out of nowhere, while we were watching television or washing dishes, "Diane, is Marcus all right?" And when I told him yes, he would just nod, like he needed to know but didn't know how to ask you directly. "He could have called," I said. My voice came out flatter than I intended. "So could you," she said, not unkindly, just honestly. She was right. I knew she was right before the words had finished leaving her mouth. I had no response that wasn't simply an admission of the same failure I was sitting in, and so I said nothing. I picked up the tea I hadn't been drinking and held it with both hands and looked at the table. The days that followed were the strange, suspended kind of days that grief creates, days that feel both endless and somehow too short, filled with logistics and phone calls and paperwork that give you something to do with your hands while your mind refuses to fully process what has happened. We arranged the funeral together, Diane and I. She handled most of it, as she had handled most things involving my father over the years, and I helped where I could and felt guilty about the years in which I had let her carry that weight alone. People came to the service that I did not recognize, neighbors, old colleagues from the plant, a man who had worked alongside my father for 20 years and cried quietly in the back row the entire time, a woman from my father's church who told me, while pressing both my hands between hers, that my father had spoken of me with such pride that she had always assumed we were close. "He showed me a photograph once," she said, "of you at your university graduation. He kept it in his wallet." I had not known that. I had not known that my father carried my graduation photograph in his wallet. I had not known because I had never asked, and he had never told me, because we were two people who had forgotten how to speak to each other about anything that actually mattered. After the service, after the people had gone home, and Diane had fallen asleep on the sofa, I drove to my father's house alone. I had not been inside in 4 years. Diane had given me the key that morning without making a thing of it, which was its own kind of grace. The house was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps I was simply older, and the rooms that had felt large and permanent to a child now revealed themselves as ordinary. The same furniture, the same photographs on the walls, school pictures of Diane and me at various ages, a wedding photograph of our parents, a framed image of a Bible verse my grandmother had cross-stitched that had hung in the same spot in the hallway for as long as I could remember. His reading chair was by the window in the living room. It was old, worn at the armrests, the fabric faded in a pattern that showed exactly where he had rested his hands night after night for years. Beside it, a small side table with a lamp, a coaster, and a neat stack of books. I sat in his chair. I don't know why I did it. I hadn't planned to, but I sat in it, in the specific dent his body had made over decades of evenings, and something about the shape of it, the way it held me in exactly the contours of a man I had never fully known, broke something open in me that I had been holding closed since the morning my sister had called. I cried in my father's chair for a long time, not just for him, for the 9-year-old boy with stage makeup still on his face, hearing that his father was sorry, for the 18-year-old who had saved his father's name in his phone without a title, thinking it was independence, for the 37-year-old who had spent a year preparing the right words and then put the phone down and told himself tomorrow would be easier. For all the tomorrows that had quietly, without announcement, run out. On the side table beside his chair, beneath the stack of books, I found something I had not expected. A notebook, small, spiral-bound, the kind you find in any corner shop, with a blue cover that was slightly warped at the edges from handling. My father's handwriting on the inside cover, careful and deliberate the way his handwriting always was. I opened it. It was not a diary exactly. There were no dates, no daily entries. It was more like a collection of thoughts, single sentences or short paragraphs, written apparently whenever something occurred to him, spread across the pages without any particular order. Some entries were practical, a reminder to call the plumber, a grocery list, a note about when to service the car. But between the practical entries, scattered throughout, were other things. Marcus called twice this week. He sounds well. I didn't say as much, but I was glad. I drove past Marcus's old school today. I don't know why, I just did. I should have gone to that school play. I have thought about it more times than I can count. I should have gone. I turned the pages slowly, carefully, the way you handle something you are afraid of damaging. Near the middle of the notebook, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the earlier entries, more recent, I thought, or perhaps written when he was tired, I found a single paragraph that stopped me completely. I know Marcus is still angry with me. I think he has a right to be. I was not the father he needed me to be, especially when he was young. I knew it then too, I think, somewhere underneath the work and the tiredness. I just didn't know how to do it differently. I want to tell him that I am proud of him, that I always have been. That the photograph in my wallet is there because I look at it sometimes and think, I must have done something right, even if I can't always remember what it was. I sat in my father's chair with his notebook in my hands and his words on the page in front of me, and I thought about the phone call I had never made, about the words I had prepared and practiced and never spoken, about the year I had spent working up the courage to say I forgave him, while he had apparently spent years sitting in this chair, in this specific dent, quietly carrying the same unspoken weight from the other side. We had both been waiting. Neither of us had called first. I took the notebook home with me that night. I didn't tell Diane about it right away, not because I was hiding it from her. She had every right to know it existed, and I would show her eventually. But that first night, I needed it to be mine alone for a little while. I needed to sit with it in my own apartment, in my own silence, and read it from beginning to end without anyone watching my face. I read it 3 times that night, cover to cover, 3 times, in the same chair by my window where I had sat the evening before with my phone in my hand and his name on the screen. The notebook was not long, maybe 60 pages of actual writing, spread across 100 pages total, the rest blank. But those 60 pages were the most complete picture I had ever been given of my father's interior life, the life that had existed behind the early mornings and the calloused hands and the lunchbox with the worn handle. The life I had never thought to ask about because I had been too busy resenting the silence to wonder what the silence was protecting. He had written about my mother often, about how much he missed her, about the specific, practical ways her absence had reorganized his days, that he still made 2 cups of tea every morning out of habit before remembering that the house felt a different kind of quiet without her, not peaceful but hollow. He had written about Diane with warmth and a specific kind of gratitude. Diane calls every Sunday without fail. I don't deserve that kind of loyalty, but I am grateful for it every single week. And he had written about me. Not bitterly, not with resentment or accusation. He had written about me the way someone writes about a place they love that they cannot find their way back to, with a longing that had no anger in it, only distance and the quiet, persistent hope that the distance might one day close. I called Dr. Osai the following Monday. I hadn't seen her in almost 8 months. I had felt, in the confidence that comes with genuine progress, that I had reached a place stable enough to manage without regular sessions. I understood now that stability and completion are not the same thing. She answered on the 2nd ring. Marcus, she said, just my name, the way she always said it, not as a greeting exactly, but as an acknowledgement. I am here, I hear you, go ahead. I told her everything. The Thursday evening, The phone, his name on the screen, the decision to wait until tomorrow, the call from Diane the next morning, the funeral, the chair, the notebook. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always valued most about her, the way she held space without filling it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she said, "How are you holding it?" Not how are you feeling, not what are you going to do, just how are you holding it? As though grief were a physical object, something with weight and edges, and the question was simply about how I was managing to carry it. "Carefully," I said. "That's honest," she said. We talked for a long time that Monday. About guilt, the specific, corrosive guilt of the person who survives a relationship that never got the chance to heal. About the difference between regret and self-punishment, and why one can lead somewhere useful while the other simply keeps you standing in the same place, turning the same thoughts over and over until they wear grooves in you. She said something that afternoon that I have returned to many times since. She said, "The call you never made, it tells you something important about where you were. The fact that you had prepared it, that you had written the words, that you were ready, that tells you something equally important about where you were going." Grief has a way of collapsing those two things together, making it feel like the call never made cancels out the intention behind it. It doesn't. Both things are true at the same time. You are still becoming the person who would have made that call. That person is real, Marcus, even if the call never happened. I wrote that down after we hung up. Not in a notebook. I wasn't ready to start a notebook of my own, yet afraid, perhaps, of what that might mean. On a folded piece of paper that I kept on my nightstand for a long time afterward, until the fold lines wore through and it fell apart, and I finally committed the words to memory instead. 3 weeks after the funeral, I went back to my father's house with Diane to begin going through his belongings. It is a particular kind of work, sorting through the life of someone you have lost. Every object carries a weight that has nothing to do with its physical size. A pair of reading glasses, a worn lunchbox kept even after retirement. A shelf of books, some with pages folded down at corners, some with pencil annotations in the margins in his careful handwriting, brief, practical notes to himself like "important" or "remember this," or simply a single question mark beside a passage that had apparently given him pause. We worked slowly, Diane and we talked more than we sorted, which I think was probably the point, or at least the need. She told me things about our father that I hadn't known, small things, accumulated from years of being the child who stayed close. That he had started attending a community gardening project on Saturday mornings after our mother died, because the house was too quiet and he needed somewhere to put his hands. That he had quietly paid for a neighbor's child's school uniform 2 years running when the family hit a difficult stretch, and had asked the school not to mention it. That he had learned in his 60s to send voice notes on his phone instead of text messages because his eyesight was going and voice notes were easier, and that for a while he had sent Diane a voice note every Sunday evening, just small things, what he had cooked for dinner, something he had read, whether the garden project had gone well. "Did he ever send you one?" Diane asked. I shook my head. "He wanted to," she said. "He told me once he didn't know if you would want to hear from him like that he was afraid you would find it intrusive." My father, a man who had spent 30 years working double shifts and carrying my photograph in his wallet and writing about me in a spiral notebook by his reading chair, had been afraid that a voice note might be intrusive. The distance between two people, I thought, is not always made of anger. Sometimes it is made of nothing more than two people, each afraid that reaching out is an imposition, waiting for the other to move first. In his bedroom closet, behind a row of neatly hung shirts, I found a shoebox. Inside the shoebox, every card I had ever sent him. Birthday cards mostly, a few Christmas cards, a card I had sent when he and my mother celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary, which I had attended briefly and left early from, and which I remembered with a specific, low-grade guilt that I now understood was proportionate to the choice I had made that day. Every card kept, some of them so old that the envelopes had yellowed at the edges. I sat on the edge of his bed with the shoebox on my knees for a long time. I thought about the version of my father I had carried for most of my adult life, the absent one, the silent one, the man who had chosen work over presence and never found the words to bridge the gap his choices had created. That version was real. I was not going to pretend otherwise, not even now, not even in his bedroom with his shoebox of saved cards in my hands. The empty chairs had been real. The silence at the dinner table had been real. The distance had been real, and it had cost both of us something that could not now be recovered. But this version was also real. The notebook, the photograph in the wallet, the voice notes to Diane on Sunday evenings, the shoebox, the man who had been afraid that reaching out might be intrusive, the man who had written, in slightly unsteady handwriting near the middle of a spiral-bound notebook, "I must have done something right, even if I can't always remember what it was." Both versions were the same man, and I had only ever allowed myself to know one of them. I took the shoebox home, along with the notebook. That night I sat at my kitchen table with both of them open in front of me, and I did something I had not done in a very long time. I talked to my father, not on a phone. There was no phone to pick up now, no name on a screen to stare at. Just me, at my kitchen table, speaking quietly into the space of my apartment, saying the things I had written in my notebook and practiced in front of no mirror and prepared for a year. I told him I understood now, that I had spent a long time being angry at a man who had simply loved me in the only language he had ever been taught, that I had seen, finally, the full shape of him, not just the absences but the quietly kept promises, the saved cards, the photograph, the entries in the notebook, that I forgave him, that I wished, more than I could express, that I had said it while he was still there to hear it. And then I said something I had not planned to say, something that came from somewhere underneath the prepared words, from a place that the year of preparation had not quite reached. I told him I was sorry too. For the 4 years without a visit, for the texts instead of calls, for the name saved in my phone without a title, for every tomorrow I had promised myself and then quietly broken, for letting my own fear of another empty chair keep me from showing up, not understanding, until now, that he had been sitting in his reading chair by the window, afraid of exactly the same thing. The apartment was very quiet when I finished. Outside, the city continued in its ordinary way, traffic, a distant siren, the sound of someone's television through the wall. The same world that had looked unchanged the morning Diane had called me, still unchanged, still indifferent to the weight of what had just happened inside one man's kitchen on an ordinary weeknight. But something in me was different, not healed. I want to be careful not to overclaim what one conversation with an empty room can do. Not resolved, not finished with the grief, which I understood by now would simply become something I learned to live alongside rather than something I ever fully left behind. But different, lighter in a specific way that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with having finally set something down that I had been carrying for a very long time. I called Mr. Ibarra the week after the funeral. I don't know exactly what made me do it. Diane had mentioned him in passing, the neighbor who had checked on my father every morning, who had noticed the kitchen light was off, who had made the call that started everything. I found his number in my father's phone, which Diane had given me along with the notebook and the shoebox. It was saved simply as Joseph next door. I introduced myself and he said, immediately, warmly, "Marcus, yes, your father spoke about you." We talked for almost an hour. He was a soft-spoken man, unhurried in the way that people become when they have reached a certain age and made peace with the pace of things. He told me about my father's daily routines, the kitchen light at 6, the garden he had started tending in the last 2 years, the particular chair he liked to sit in on the front step on Sunday mornings with his tea, watching the street come alive. He was a quiet man, Mr. Ibarra said, but not an unhappy one. I want you to know that. In these last years especially, I think he had found a kind of peace. He talked about the past sometimes, things he wished he had done differently, but he didn't carry it bitterly. He carried it the way old men carry old things, carefully and with a kind of acceptance. Did he talk about me? I asked. The question came out more quietly than I intended. Often, Mr. Ibarra said. He told me once that you were the best thing he had ever done and that he wasn't sure you knew it. I told him he should call you and say so. He said he didn't want to impose. I had to put the phone down for a moment, just for a moment, to breathe. When I picked it back up, Mr. Ibarra was still there, patient and unhurried, as though he had expected the pause. I was going to call him, I said. The night before he died, I had the phone in my hand, I put it down. I know, he said gently. He told me he was hoping you would call, not with any bitterness, just hopping. I have thought about that a great deal since then. My father, sitting in his reading chair on the Thursday evening, I held my phone and put it down, quietly hoping I would call. Me on the other side of the city, telling myself tomorrow would be easier. Both of us, in different rooms, carrying the same unspoken thing toward each other across a distance neither of us closed in time. I have had to make a deliberate decision not to let that image destroy me. Not because it doesn't hurt, it does, in a way that I suspect will not fully leave me for the rest of my life, but because the alternative to making peace with it is to spend the years I have left being consumed by a grief that has already taken enough. My father spent 30 years working himself to exhaustion out of love he didn't know how to express differently. I spent 20 years maintaining a distance I thought was self-protection. We were, in the end, more similar than either of us ever acknowledged. Two people who loved each other from a careful distance, waiting for the other to cross it first, until time made the decision for us. I don't want to be that man with the people I love now. That is the most concrete, actionable thing my father's death has given me, not just grief, not just regret, a specific daily determination not to wait, not to put the phone down and tell myself tomorrow, not to let pride or fear or the comfortable habit of distance make the decision about who I reach out to and when. I started visiting my father's house more regularly after that, not because he was there, he wasn't, and the house would eventually be sold, and I understood that, but because there were things in that house that deserved more time than I had given them. Books with pencil annotations in the margins, photographs I had never properly looked at, a garden he had started tending in his last 2 years that no one had watered since his death. I watered it every Saturday morning, the way Mr. Ibarra told me my father had done, early, before the day got too warm, with a particular green watering can I found in the shed that still had soil on the handle from the last time he had used it. It was not a dramatic act. It was not a resolution or a ceremony. It was just a man watering his dead father's garden on Saturday mornings because it needed to be done and because doing it felt, in some way I couldn't fully articulate, like a conversation we were still having. Diane came sometimes. We would work in the garden together and talk, really talk, the way we hadn't done enough of while our father was alive, the way grief has a particular talent for unlocking. She told me things she had never said. I told her things I had kept to myself for years. We disagreed sometimes and said so and continued anyway. It felt like practice for something, for the version of ourselves we were trying to become. 4 months after my father's death, I did something I had not done since I was a child. I went to his church. Not to become religious, I want to be honest about that. My relationship with faith is complicated and personal and not something I feel the need to resolve publicly. But I went because the woman who had held my hands at the funeral and told me about the photograph in his wallet attended that church, and she had invited me, and I had found myself, in the months since, curious about the community that had known a version of my father I had never seen. It was a small congregation, warm in the way that small communities are warm, not performatively, but practically. People who knew each other's names and each other's burdens and showed up for each other in ordinary, unglamorous ways. The woman, whose name I learned was Sister Agnes, introduced me to people who had known my father for years. A man who had sat beside him every Sunday for a decade and said my father had told him, unprompted, on more than one occasion, that he believed his son would do great things. A young woman who had been struggling financially and whom my father had quietly helped, not with money, which he didn't have much of, but with a referral, a phone call, the particular currency of a man who had spent 30 years building quiet credibility through consistent, unglamorous work. I sat in a pew that afternoon in a church I had never visited and listened to stories about a man I had spent 20 years believing I knew, and I understood, finally and completely, that I had only ever known one room of him, the room that faced me, the room where his absence had been loudest. The rest of the house had been full. I am 38 years old now. I have not yet fully forgiven myself for the phone call I never made. I am not sure full forgiveness of that particular failure is something I will ever entirely reach, and I have made a kind of peace with that uncertainty, understanding that carrying some regret is not the same as being destroyed by it, and that a man can acknowledge what he got wrong without making that acknowledgement the whole of his identity. What I have done is change. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone watching from the outside would necessarily notice, but in the specific, daily way that matters most, in how I handle the impulse to wait, in how I treat the people I love when it would be easier to be quiet, in how I pick up the phone. My father left me many things: the notebook, the shoebox of cards, the photograph he carried in his wallet, the garden on Saturday mornings, the stories from people who knew him in rooms I had never entered. But the most important thing he left me was not an object. It was the understanding that love, unexpressed, is still love, but it is love that cannot do its work. It sits inside you, real and genuine, and completely invisible to the person it belongs to, until it is either spoken or it is simply too late. He knew he loved me. I knew I loved him. We just never managed to say it clearly, in the same room, at the same time, before time made that particular conversation impossible. I am saying it now, to the empty space his absence has left, and to anyone listening who still has the chance I no longer have. Say it today, not tomorrow. Tomorrow is not guaranteed. The kitchen light might simply not come on. If this story moved something in you the way it still moves in me, leave a comment below. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share it with them, not tomorrow. If this is the kind of story that speaks to your heart, stay with us. There are more waiting to be told.